So today I am going to review and we are going to practice optimal movement principles. So a few things that I want to share with you about optimal movement before we get started are we use internal references of our own body for alignment as opposed to anything exterior. So you may have been in classes in the past where they will ask you to line up your hips with the long edge of your mat, or they might ask you to bring the outside edge of your foot parallel with the short edge of your mat. You know, I'm just kind of making things up. Another one that you might have heard could be, I just totally lost my train of thought. I had another one and I forgot it. Anyway, we won't be using external references for our alignment. We think that alignment is important, but when it comes to optimal movement, we want to use our own body as a guide for those alignment ideas. The other thing that you might hear us say a lot in class is find your neutral spine. And the reason that I want to bring your awareness to that is in many classes in the past, I have been told to quote unquote flatten my spine, which one is not even physically, you can't do it. It's not possible. And our spine is designed perfectly to carry load, right? We have this big, heavy head. And nature is amazing, right? We just have to trust the intelligence of nature and our body. We have a natural curve that occurs at our cervical spine here at our neck. And we also have a natural curve that occurs here at our low back, at our lumbar spine. Now, those might be to varying degrees for, or curvature for certain people. But in general, what we want to do is have you find your neutral spine in many of these things that we're going to be exploring. One of the most liberating things for me to learn about my own body as I was practicing throughout the years and had a lot of difficulty moving with ease and freedom on my mat is that proportions play into our practice in a very, very big way. And if you're curious about your own proportions, what I'm going to have you do is sit down. You might even extend your legs straight out in front of you and bring your palms right here next to your hips. Just notice, some of you may have limbs, your arms, long enough so that you could press into your palms and place a little weight into them. Some of you might even have a little bit of strength, and if you pressed really hard, you might even be able to lift the load of your torso. For me, when I flex at the wrist and I bring my arms down by my side, because of the length of my torso and my arms, my palms do not even touch the mat, which again, kind of plays into how I move or the lack of movement or freedom or flexibility as I move around. We'll get into that a little bit later, but just keep that in my mind. Proportions play into your practice a great deal. Optimal movement versus moving, what that means to me is in lieu of trying to utilize muscles that we shouldn't necessarily be using to create a movement in our body, because our bodies are amazing. They really want to please us and do things that we're asking of it to do. And so if we're moving in a way where we should be using our leg strength and our neck and our jaw and our tongue and our shoulders are trying to do that work for us, that's not healthy movement. That's not optimal movement. So point is, our body is really amazing at compensating. And so I want to try to get you a little more familiar with where the movement's coming from, where you want to feel that strength, and see if we can dial into that as opposed to all of these other body parts that like to help out. Breath, of course, is the nexus of our yoga practice. If we're not breathing well, if we're not breathing with ease, that might be something to get curious about. I always like to remind people to come back to their breath as a gauge. It can be one of the best gauges that you have in terms of moving optimally. And if you're not breathing well, I'll give you some ideas about how we could change things, or just ease up, back up a little tiny bit, or even come out of a pose and back in so that we can keep our breath flowing. Lastly, can you try to find this concept that we have referred to as effortless effort? Right? Doesn't mean that things are going to be easy. Doesn't mean that you're not going to be building strength and balance and it gets a little bit challenging, but can you find that sweet spot where you're working, it feels like you're doing something, but you can still breathe with ease? That to me is effortless effort. So without further ado, let's get into the 6 movements of the spine. So finding your way into a comfortable seated position. And as you find your way into a comfortable seated position, for me, I like to elevate the floor because I like to place a little bit of weight into my arms as I come into these movements of the spine, this side to side position. And so elevating the floor is really helpful. And then I'm going to have you start to find your neutral spine, right? Especially seated position. You know, sometimes I'm leaning forward a little bit into my hands. See if you can start to stack up your shoulders over your hips. You might start to think about where your head is in space, maybe even thinking about center line of the ear over the shoulders to start to find that natural curve, because sometimes that heavy head, we have a tendency to sort of bring the head forward to carry that weight. You might just roll the shoulders around a little bit, see if you can find some ease there. And here in this neutral spine position, how would it feel to just notice your breath? See if you start to drop into your body as you bring awareness to your breath. For me, that's a very grounding practice. And as you have your awareness on your breath, you might notice it feels good to start to slow it down, to make it more intentional. Finding a little ease in the belly. Any tension or contraction in your abdominal muscles, could you allow those to relax and release? They shouldn't be working for you here. We have elicited other muscles in the body to keep us in the most upright position that we can be in here in the seated position, but it's typically not those abdominal muscles that can be contracted very unconsciously throughout our day, right? It's sort of just a cultural thing for us to like keep the navel sucked in all the time. If you do that, see what you can do to let go of that. I'm going to take about 3 more breaths here. Excellent. If your eyes are closed, gently blink them open. So we're going to start off with the 6 movements of the spine. It's 3 times 2, right? We have 3 different movements that we do on each side. So I'm going to start by bringing a hand down to the surface next to my hip, and then taking my fingers to my shoulder, and then opening the space in between the bottom ribs and the top of the hip. Oh, you know, one of the most important things that I didn't mention that is almost one of the most important for the principles of optimal movement, and we're going to move from the largest joint first. Typically, that's our shoulders and our hips. So right here, we're moving just in the spine, but I want to isolate to the spine as opposed to moving and initiating movement with the arm or the shoulder. I'm just opening up the side body. And then if you want to add load, add load. But we're not starting the movement with the arm. We're just kind of leaning into that supporting hand and taking a few breaths. You might feel a little opening between the ribs. And then as you're ready, finding your way back up to a neutral spine. Weight into the opposite hand, finding that movement right here first, right? So think about moving the spine. There you go. Yeah, sometimes just kind of moving back and forth in between those spaces, in between neutral and a little C curve helps us to be like, oh, there it is. And then if you want to add load, you can extend the arm in a way that feels good. Taking your gaze anywhere that feels good on your neck. And then breathing. Right, because it's not really an optimal practice if we're not mindful, if we're not becoming aware of our breath as we breathe. It's information. Coming back to center, might feel good to roll your shoulders around a little bit. And now we're going to take twist of the spine. I'm going to have you go ahead and bring your palms together right here at your sternum. My thumbs are right here. If you have nice long fingers, you might even bring your fingers, long fingers underneath your chin. And what I notice is I'm leaning forward. I'm going to see if I can find my neutral spine here. And then I'm going to initiate the movement by asking the muscles required to create that twist. It's those muscles along the ribs. We call them the obliques. And you're going to twist, keeping your gaze right out over the fingertips. Maybe even a little sensation of fingers under chin. And just ease into it. Find some ease with your breath. Sometimes I have to check in with my shoulders. And then if you want to take your neck into the twist, you're going to do it very mindfully, taking chin closer to the shoulder. But we're not initiating the movement with the head for our twist. We don't even have to twist in the neck. It's just an option. If it feels good, you can take that twist, but do it last at the neck. Take a few breaths. Just notice what you're noticing in your body. It's little tiny pieces of information. If you have any sensation that is a little sharp shooting pain, back up a little bit. Coming back to center, I'm going to bring my head back to neutral, just very systematically today, bringing the torso back to neutral, rolling out my shoulders. And this is that side where I have sort of a lot of tension underneath that right scapula, that right shoulder blade. I'm going to try to twist today in a way that I don't get that lit up. So my twist might be really, really tiny. That's okay. It's okay, Colleen, right? Sometimes less is more. We don't have to feel, and we certainly should not feel intense sensation. You might not feel any sensation at all. If you want to take your neck into it, chin a little closer to the shoulder, and then breathe. Systematically coming out of this for me, I'm bringing head back to neutral, torso back to neutral. Roll out the shoulders, wiggle around, shake it out, let it go. And because we're creatures of habit, I always crisscross my legs with front leg in front of right leg. You don't have to switch it up, but for my seated cat-cow, I'm just going to switch up the cross of my legs, just because. And we're going to take some seated cat-cows. I'm going to turn. You do not have to turn. I just want to show you my profile as I move back and forth in between these two spaces, convexly and concavely in my seated cat-cow. So I'm going to first see if I can find my neutral spine. And then as I catch my next inhale, I'm going to tilt the pelvis forward, hip points come forward, heart moves forward. I might take my gaze up a little bit. Doesn't have to be intense there in the neck. Take a couple of breaths. Just so you can kind of get that sensation of this shape here, and then catch your next exhalation. Press into your palms lightly as you sit back onto your sitting bones, rounding between the shoulders. Head might become heavy. If it feels good, take a breath or two there, just opening up between the shoulder blades, and then moving back and forth in between those two spaces. Might feel good to even contract the shoulder blades towards the spine a little bit. And then open up between the shoulder blades as you rock back. I'm going to take about 2 more rounds of seated cat-cow. Eventually finding my way back into a neutral spine position. Roll out your shoulders, wiggle around, let it go. So I want to take a pause here. Do you guys have any questions about those 6 movements of the spine? And if you do, feel free to unmute yourself. Okay, yes, Shirley. Go ahead. Oh, there you got it. Oh.
I do notice that sometimes I like tighten up my legs, and I presume I should probably try not to do that, correct?
Well, I'm glad that you asked that question, because I want to address 2 things. One, that's incredibly aware of you to notice that your hips and your legs are helping you to create those movements with the spine. And yes, the ideal thing is to try to find some ease in those parts, because really they're not there to do the work for you. It's all of the torso and the spine and all of the surrounding muscles that you want to work for you. The second point I want to make about that is this. Like, we have to just find some ease with how we practice too, right? So if we want to move in this optimal movement way and we have information, that's great to have. Don't get too hung up on it. It's spirit of the law and trying to practice and finding that movement without the other body parts working. It's not letter of the law. So if you notice that they're working, it's okay. And that might start to change, right? So with more awareness and more practice, you might find ease in those parts where you don't necessarily want them working.
Thanks.
My pleasure. Anybody else? Okay, so we're eventually going to get to those 6 movements of the spine in a horizontal position from table. But before we do that, I'm going to have you find some forward folds. So seated forward folds. What I'm going to do first is finding a little bit of extension into my legs, meaning I'm bringing them out and away. If for a forward fold, especially if this first one if it is the first one of the day, you might start with some softness underneath the knees. You might even place a prop underneath your knees. And then finding your neutral spine first, I'm going to hinge at the pelvis here at the hips. And once the pelvis stops moving, so this is kind of it, you can already see, like, as I lean into this, as this stops, my upper back, you can see just a little bit of gentle roundness. That's just information. Means that my pelvis stopped here at the hip socket. And it might even feel good to allow your entire spine to round and roll into it, allowing the head to become heavy. Taking a few breaths there in your seated forward fold. Finding your way back up to a neutral spine. Bringing the soles of the feet to the mat. As you bring the soles of the feet to the mat, if, for example, you brought your feet pretty close, you might notice that the upper back starts to round. If I bring my feet out and away, I might start to find a little bit more of a neutral spine. Again, it's spirit of the law versus letter of the law. And then I'm going to allow my knees to drop off to the side like we're opening up a book. You might even bring props underneath the knees. And same thing here, you're going to start to hinge at the largest joints here at the hips to find your forward fold in a butterfly position. So forward folds can be done a few different ways, meaning the spine might be neutral the entire time, right? So if I brought myself up, I might hang out here with more of a neutral spine. It might feel good to fold in and allow the back to round and curve. I'm going to say round. Curve seems like the opposite direction to me. Take a few breaths. I'm going to find my way back up. And before I move positions, I want to also show you some people have very limited movement here at this large joint, the hips. And if they had very little movement, it might feel good for them to be here with a little roll into the cervical spine and the shoulders as opposed to a hinge. And then just allowing gravity to kind of take over. Right, because everybody's built differently. Just notice what you're noticing. All right, that's forward folds. Finding your way into table. We're gonna see if we can find those 6 movements of the spine. And as we're here, you might notice, we're gonna add a little bit of load to the body to find those movements. So as you find your way into table, position your hands in a place that feels nice and grounded, building a good foundation for your arms. For me, I kind of like just shuffle around a little bit. See if you can find your neutral spine here in your table. Right? Because sometimes I like press in, I'm like, okay, I'm ready to go. Well, that's not exactly my neutral spine. If I have a little natural curve here at my low back, as I know I'm built, I'm going to try to figure out where my head is in space so that this curve at my cervical spine at the neck is fairly neutral. And then just pause there, take a couple of breaths. And we will get started with our cat-cow from this table position. And I'm going to cue it in a fairly nuanced way, moving from the largest joint first. We're going to allow the pelvis to tilt down, belly drops. You can kind of feel your chest and ribs drop down, and then gazing forward. I don't like to take my gaze up too far. That doesn't feel so good. Behind my neck. Just pause there, keep breathing. And then you're going to find a spot out in front of you, if this is helpful, so that you initiate the movement from the pelvis again. Keep staring at that spot as you reverse the movement in the pelvis, round through your shoulders. Eventually, head is going to have to move, and it might feel good to allow it to get heavy. Take a pause here, take a couple of breaths. You might find a spot in between your knees or your lower legs to stare at as you take your next movement into your happy cow. And then moving into your cats. If you want to match up breath to movements, inhale, belly drops, gaze comes forward, exhale, reverse it, right? You're kind of compressing naturally all the air out of the lungs. Okay, maybe not all, some. Just moving back and forth in between those spaces with the spine, front to back. I'm going to take 2 more rounds. And then if you want to take the opportunity to send the hips back, roll out your wrists, shake out your hands, little relief into the wrists, be my guests. And then finding your way back into a tabletop position, we're going to take those C curves with the spine, just like we did when we were seated. So think about drawing hip and shoulder a little closer together and chin a little bit closer to your shoulder. Take a pause there, just feel the stretch along the opposite side, right? Just in between the bottom ribs and the top of the hip, just like when you were seated, coming back to neutral. Hip and shoulder a little closer together, creating that space along here. And then if it feels good, chin towards the shoulder. Moving back and forth in between those 2 spaces. To find the side stretch in a horizontal position. You might have noticed that we start with these spinal movements at the beginning of class, right? Like that is our nervous column, our spine, right? And so doing these movements just helps to kind of, I don't know, coordinate it, energize it. Not sure what it means for you, but for me, it feels really good. Just kind of waking up the entire system. Again, if it feels good, sit back or sit up, roll out your wrist, or you can stay right there in your table. You don't have to move. And then lastly, we're going to take a twist with our spine. And let me tell you, I am constantly learning new things, and this is a new thing that I learned this weekend. If you have a block, you're going to take your block, especially if you have short arms like me, and you're going to place it maybe underneath the opposite armpit. I'm going to twist towards you to get started. I'm going to take a hold of that block and think about this. Remember the twist that we did in our seated upright position, and we were initiating the movement with these muscles here at the ribs? I want you to do something very similar. And again, I always have to say, like, do what I say, not what I do, because I'm still trying to put this together in my body as I say it. I'm going to start the twist, and this hand, this opposite hand and arm are just along for the ride as I slide the block, right? I'm not initiating the movement with the arm or the hand. It's just along for the ride. This just gives me a place to kind of rest the weight of my torso as I take this twist one direction. And it might be a little tiny twist. Pause there, take a few breaths. You might even ask yourself, are you feeling it in the obliques, those muscles along the ribs? Are your hips still level? As we switch sides, if you want, sit up, roll out the wrist of the supporting arm, shake out the hand, let it go. And then we're going to do that on the opposite side. Again, I'm going to see if I can get into my body. So I'm just going to be quiet and try to move and breathe at the same time as I take twist other direction. Head is just along for the ride, so take your gaze anywhere that feels good on your neck and take a few breaths. As you're ready, untwist. Sit up, roll out your wrist, because we're going to come back into table. If it feels good, shake it out, let it go. All right. So in these other positions, in these other movements, even though we're fairly low to the ground, these are balance and strength shapes, forms that we're going to create. So finding your way back into your table, build that foundation with your hands to support your arms. Find your neutral spine. Then extend your legs straight back behind you so you're on the ball of your back foot. It might even feel good. Let's just get into the ball of that foot. Articulate around a little bit. It feels really good in my calf. And then from here, I'm going to give you options about how you can add load to play with your balance. Just explore. Like there's no end result, just think about this as being a little playful and some exploration. So if I'm going to try to keep my hips level, you could even play a little game and place a block right there on your hips. Start to float your toes away from the floor, noticing if your hips are still level. Again, it's spirit of the law versus letter of the law. We're just adding load, right? This is a balancing pose. If you want to add more load, you're going to take the opposite arm and extend it forward or out to the side or somewhere in between, or maybe the palm's down here, but it's barely touching. For 3, 2, 1. Bring those points back down to support your table. And we'll do that on the other side. So start just with a little bit of articulation, a little stretch for your calf muscle. That feels good. Right? And then from here, maybe toes come away from the floor. I promise you there's nothing special about trying to get your heel as high as your hip. We're just adding load. And at the same time, we're trying to keep our hips level. So if that means you're just barely floating toes away like I am, perfect. And then if you want to add more load, opposite palm comes away from the mat. Whoa, hang on there, Colleen. You can have palm down with support in both arms, or 2 points. For 3, 2, 1. Everything touches down. Let's take a child's pose. So if you want to keep your spine neutral, the way I do that is I create space by drawing knees apart, shifting the hips back, and then lowering all the way down. If you're not coming all the way down, hips can be elevated. You could bring something to rest your head on that's elevated, right? Think about these props as the most amazing tool that you have for your yoga practice. What I have learned from my husband, as you're ready, you're going to come on up into seated, is that tools, having the right tool for the job, is one of the best things in the world, right? You can find a lot of ease when you've got the right tools in place. Okay, so from here, we're just going to come right up into our mountain pose. I'm gonna switch cameras. And we're gonna move a little bit. Wow, where does the time go? So I'm gonna have you guys play with this. Play with creating a mountain that I cue you into. So I'm gonna have you come onto your feet. You're gonna bring your shoulders back and down. You're gonna lock out your knees, you're gonna tuck your tailbone, and you're gonna think about crown of the head reaching up to the ceiling, maybe palms forward. Okay, let me guide that again. Come onto your feet, lock out your knees, tuck your tailbone, draw your shoulder blades together, palms forward, crown of the head reaching up to the ceiling. And then let that go. Whew. I don't know about you, but when I'm cued to come into a mountain pose like that, it does not provide me with that sense of effortless effort. Like there's a lot of gripping and tension and I'm not breathing well. That's not the mountain that I want to build. That's not the mountain I want to stand on top of. So I'm going to have you find your way into your version of mountain. Like how can you be in the most upright position, creating just enough tone in your body so that you're standing there sort of at attention, but you can still breathe with ease. And then take a few breaths. Maybe there's just a hint of softness behind the knees. That's what I'm looking for, because I am notorious for locking out my knees. And then I'm going to ask myself how my low back feels. And you might notice it feels good to sway a little bit in your mountain. Right? There is stillness. I mean, there is movement in stillness. We are living, breathing human beings. Can you find strength in the ease of your mountain? What does that mean for you? If your eyes are closed, gently blink them open. And we're going to do just a little bit of breath to movement. So on your next inhale, float your arms overhead. And then as you exhale, bring them down. Inhale, arms rise. Exhale, they fall. Inhale, bring them up. And think about moving from the hips and the knees as you find your way into a forward fold, right? Hips go back, knees come forward for me. If you want to bring a little weight into your hands, you might even grab your fabulous tools. Grab your blocks, and then allow the head to hang heavy. With a little weight into my hands, I can just find some ease in my forward fold. Nothing special about having straight legs in a forward fold. Now that doesn't mean that as you hang out here and in your subsequent forward folds, as you practice, that you might start to open up here, right? This is all about building trust with our body. It's not about having tight hamstrings that you have to open. I promise that's not what it's about. It's our body listening to us and going, oh, okay, she's not going to jam me into a straight leg forward fold. Now I might open a little bit more, and it might feel good. Bring your awareness to your breath. And then as you're ready, you're going to rise all the way up. Come up. Arms come down. Shake it out, let it go. I'm going to bring us into some warrior poses this morning so that we can talk about where the movement's coming from, what we're kind of doing in the body or what the body is doing for us, so that you have some awareness, and then you'll have that information for later. So I'm going to find my way up to the front of the mat to move into my warrior pose. There are a lot of different ways that we can get into warrior. from here. So I'm going to skip the whole plank and down dog business today. We're just going to step right into our crescent by taking one leg back behind us. And as you take that step, right, like give yourself the opportunity to find your balance. Move around a little bit. If you need to reposition the foot, reposition the foot. I have my heel away from the mat. My front knee is over my ankle, más o menos. It's not in front of, it could be back behind if that felt better, right? Like I could shift the weight back just a little bit. And then what you do with the arms is all about whether or not you want to add load to this particular form. You could have your arms here with hands on hips. If that feels grounded and good, stay right there. You could have palms at your heart. You could ease your way into a little more load with cactus or arms overhead, right? You might notice as you change the position of the arms, it might get just a tiny bit more challenging. Flexion in this front hip, extension into this leg that I have the foot back behind me. Now from this position, I'm going to bring my hands back to my hips. I'm going to open my hips into my warrior two. The front hip that is in flexion is the hinge point. So think about moving from that large joint to open up into your warrior two. Shoulders are over my hips. My hips are off at a bit of an angle. Perfect. Because I stopped to keep this knee over the ankle. Now, from shoulders over hips, hands are going to come to my shoulders, and then I'm going to extend my arms straight out. Warrior two. For my reverse warrior, let's go back and revisit our side stretch when we were seated. I'm going to take my back hand to my hip, flip my front palm over, and thinking about that space in between the bottom ribs and the top of the hip, open that space without shifting your pelvis. We're not doing a back bend. We're reaching the direction of that back elbow. So come back with your arms. Bring your hands to your hips. So with my arms flared out, somewhat parallel to my shoulders, this back elbow is kind of my directional sign. So if I extend my front arm out, palm up, I'm kind of directing this side stretch towards my back elbow. Back leg is straight. If your front leg is talking to you a little too much, straighten it. We're doing same movement with the spine with less load. When you bend the knee, you're adding load. For 3, 2, 1. Back into your warrior two position. Straighten that front leg. We're going to pivot our toes. So now we're finding our way into our optimal wide leg forward fold. So this might be a great gauge for the position of your legs to find your neutral spine. If I take my legs wider, yes, I can do a forward fold with much wider legs, but what that does is that puts so much compression into my low back because I've kind of dumped into it, I've arched. So I want you to find your neutral spine here. We're moving from the largest joint, the hips, as we hinge. You might find that bringing some blocks down to support you here in this neutral spine position of your wide leg forward fold could feel really good. And just like with your seated forward fold, you could hang out here with a neutral spine, or if it feels good, allow gravity to take over. And just allow the spine to round a little bit or a lot, whatever happens in your body. If you're doing something and it doesn't feel good, don't do it. Right? So you have to get in tune with what's going on in your body, how it feels. Can you breathe? If you're not breathing, that's information. To come out of this, I'm going to find my neutral spine, más o menos, and then I'm going to hinge from the largest joint to bring myself up. Stay in that wide-legged position, right where you're at, and we're simply going to pivot to find our way into Warrior Two on the other side. So for me, what I know about my Warrior Two is that this back leg needs to internally rotate a little bit. As I bend the knee, I don't want it to move in front of my ankle. I want it to stay right over the top or back behind. Then I'm going to think about my shoulders over my hips, and then I'm going to extend my arms. And then I'm going to take a few breaths. Just notice what you're noticing here in your Warrior Two. Like, this is a lot of work. Legs are doing the work. Extension, flexion, carrying load of the torso, the upper body. The shoulders should not be tense. They're not doing the work for you. If they are, ease up a little bit. Straighten that front leg. Could just be a tiny bit. Now I'm going to bring back hand to my hip. If I flare it out so it's somewhat parallel with this back shoulder, sorry, I'm patting the mic, flipping the front palm over, and see if I can get my alignment here, and then opening the space between bottom front ribs and top of the hip. So this is not a back bend. This is a side body opener. If your front leg is, or that bent leg is talking to you a little too much, just straighten it a little bit. Do a gentle reverse. For 3, 2, 1, right back into your Warrior Two. Pause there. Now this is where it gets a little bit tricky. Don't worry if you have to reposition your feet. Like, it doesn't have to be like dancer-like. What we're going to do is we're going to start to move so that the hips are going to be facing those toes on the bent leg. And I'm going to come onto the ball of the back foot, right back into my crescent lunge, facing the opposite direction. If you need to soften that back knee to get rid of this compression, the arch in your low back, because you don't have a lot of extension into this hip on the leg that's on the back, just soften it a little bit. As I heard an instructor say the other day, see if you can find the harmony in the form that you're creating. And then if you want to add load, add load. From here, I'm going to come right back into my Warrior Two, pivoting right back into my wide-legged forward fold stance. And now I'm going to bring my legs together just enough so that I'm going to find my way into goddess or onto horse. The rotation in the leg happens up here at the socket. I don't initiate the movement down there at my toes. Matter of fact, you might take the leg, rotate it manually, and then allow the toes to come along for the ride. Lift toes up, rotate, and then bring them down. Start to bend the knees, we're adding load. Is your spine still neutral? If it's not, come back up, reposition, adjust, do something different. Take a few breaths. If you want to add load or not. Start to straighten your legs. Shake it out, wiggle around, let it go. I'm going to heel toe my feet back into neutral position, legs back into neutral. All right. We're going to do 2 balancing poses, and then we'll come down to the floor. So for warrior 3, I'm going to turn so that I'm looking at the short edge of my mat, just for orientation purposes. I'm going to take a step back. So you can see there are reasons to have external references, but it's not for body alignment. It's just to get you into position so you can use your mat. As I take a step forward and I place the majority of the weight into that front foot, think about when we were in table and I asked you to float your toes away from the mat, right? You were lifting the load of the leg that was back behind you, and I wanted you to keep your hips level. Can you find that same movement here? It is rotation of socket over ball in our warrior 3. And it might be a tiny, tiny little movement. You could have a toe on the mat back behind you for a little bit of balance. You might feel safer and more secure, but you have the majority of the weight on that supporting leg in the front. And then if you do hinge, think about keeping your hips level as you glide over that ball in the socket. For 3, 2, 1. Right, so the ball and socket, that's your fulcrum. You're just like a teeter-totter. Movement might be a little tiny, might be greater. Everybody's built differently. Let's do that on the other side. So just taking your time. I like to bring my hands here to my hips, kind of keep a gauge of what they're doing. I'm not coming into it so fast that I'm not aware of what's going on with my hips. I'm still breathing. And then you can let your body tell you, you want to go a little further? Go for it. If you notice little rotation in the pelvis, that's okay. It's spirit of the law versus letter of the law. Just be aware of what you're aiming for. For 3, 2, 1. Come on up. I'm going to turn to face the camera. You can stay right where you're at. As we come into tree, find your mountain. Up on the ball of 1 foot, keeping your hips stable and still. Externally rotate 1 leg. And then as you think about lifting the load of that leg, try not to dump into your other hip, meaning, does this happen in order for you to balance? If it does, that's information that maybe you don't lift quite as high, or maybe you don't lift at all, right? I want to find stability and strength in that standing leg. It's externally rotated on the other side, trying to keep my hips fairly square and neutral. And then if you want, once you've lifted it, place it lightly. Take a few breaths. If you want to add load, you add load. Every day is different. And if you fall out, it's no big deal. I promise. Nice. Before you just move on to the other side, take a pause. Just notice weight in your supporting legs and the feet. Rotate your leg bone. Notice your hips. And then titrate in. Add load to the extent that feels good. And then when you're ready, come on out. Find your way down onto your mat. We have a really short Shavasana time, so if you need to leave right at 10 after, you only have about a minute. Thank you for joining me. If you have time and you can hang out for a bit, I'd love to give you a little more time. I'll bring you out in about 5 minutes if that's okay. If you can hang out with me, find your way into a position that would feel good to you. Maybe you take a little scan through your body, and as you scan through, just asking different parts of your body to relax if that feels good. If getting relaxed means closing your eyes, can you give yourself the luxury of closing your eyes? And trust that I'll bring you out. If you've fallen into a pretty good state of relaxation, start to come out slowly and subtly. Small movements in your fingers and toes. A little deeper breath. Big stretch or a yawn or a sigh. You might take your time easing your way up into a seated position. Thank you so much for joining me this morning. May you find a little effortless effort in your day. Do either of you have any questions or comments or feedback?
Love it. I love the emphasis on rotating the hip instead of using all your other body parts to move between your hip and your knees.
Right?
Yeah.
Because if you start there, then all of the downline joints aren't being stressed. They're just, that limb is along for the ride. And your body's so intelligent, right? Like the second that I put all of that together, then I just felt like the organization of all of those micro muscles in my body were then like, okay, now I know what to do. It just feels different.
I was wondering if sometimes a tight hip might because you're using everything but that hip joint, so it's atrophying.
Good point, Cindy. Good point. One of the things that one of our instructors that one of our mentors refers to our low back as the superhero muscles, like oftentimes we're moving in a way that we're not utilizing the muscles that are required. And so our low back is constantly trying to do the work for us. And so once you understand where the movement's coming from, and then the body can then organize like that movement, then you might get some relief in your low back because it's no longer trying to do all of the work most of the time. Thank you for sharing that. Mm-hmm. Shirley, you had a comment or a question?
Yeah, when we were doing, I hope I get the names right, reverse warrior.
Yeah.
Yeah, I realized I've been doing it wrong because when you said, like aim for your shoulder, I think that's what you said.
Oh, I said aim your elbow at your
for your
direction.
elbow, right. And then I realized, oh, this is what I'm supposed to be doing.
Well, so and it's not wrong. It's just now you have new information and you're like, oh, that's a side stretch and not a back bend?
Right, and I've been doing a back bend, and it's like, okay, this feels much better, actually.
That makes me so happy. Because what happens oftentimes is the way we're cued into reverse, we have twisted our spine, and then we're compressing our spine, and that is no bueno. That's not good. So,
yeah,
yes,
so
right on.
Thank you for that verbal cue. That worked really well.
Right on.
Or cool. Visual cue. Right.
Very good. Awesome.
Anything well, you all else? Have a good day.
Again, hope you find some effortless effort in your day.